it's just so important. Like I think it could be the most important issue in the world today, even to the extent that all these other kind of emergencies, catastrophes, crises depend on our being able to give attention to things in the right way. And to the extent that these media systems are kind of the windshield, through which we're driving the car of our lives, planet, et cetera. I think this, this is a kind of a first order importance issue. So, so thank you for hosting this workshop. Thank you for having me. So my background, I don't know what field I'm in anymore, if I ever did. My background kind of spans the humanities and tech and all over the place. I'm kind of an intellectual mutt. So what I'll do is talk about. So we've been given this question of how should the concept of attention be conceptualized so it can enable us to understand potential solutions for the current challenges of the attention economy. So I'll talk briefly just about one way in which I've done this in some of my work. There are many ways of slicing all of this up, of course. And then at the risk of being kind of too cheeky, I'll ask two questions in response to this question that I hope could be helpful in piecing through some kind of mapping the landscape of possibilities for where this kind of project of linguistic conceptual engineering could go. So in my own work, so I kind of came at this issue from working in the tech industry and then, developing these products, and kind of in this period when, there was still quite a lot of optimism. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when basically every news story about Google was good. And there was this kind of sense of like, this ecstatic sense of purpose of like, it's like in the TV show Silicon Valley, every presentation ends with them saying, and we're making the world a better place. Like it's kind of actually how it was. But I think, when I started to realize in my own life kind of what this sort of barrage of devices, barrage of information was kind of doing, and I started to kind of look across the industry and the world and see, okay, we're not actually sort of, bringing people's intentions back into the sort of the foreground of these persuasive systems. We're actually just distracting them in worse and more effective ways. I kind of began to be very concerned about this question of distraction. And so I came into this landscape of stuff from the issue of like kind of tech distraction. And then from there, kind of it expanded out, which I think in one way is almost a microcosm of kind of this question of developing a broader conception of attention. So in my own work, in my life, it kind of started with this nugget of like kind of the feeling of distraction and expanded out into, in one direction, it expanded out was essentially kind of this direction of the question of will. And so kind of going back to William James's, in Principles of Psychology, where he calls it effort of attention, the essential phenomenon of will. And so one way that I've expanded that kind of attention as a concept, was starting with the spotlight of attention, which cognitive scientists use this term, kind of the way that we're giving kind of immediate awareness to things in our immediate task domain. So broadening out from there to using kind of Harry Frankfurt's conception of the will, if the kind of the task domain is about doing what you want to do, so then you have these questions in that domain of, distracted by notifications, interrupted by people IMing you at 3 a.m. to, from work or whatever, fragmentation, disruption of work and memory, all this kind of stuff. And there's even research that not even just notifications, just presence of your phone on the table can actually kind of be a hit to your working memory. So kind of in the task domain, ways in which our attention is disrupted, if that's kind of that first level of it. So then kind of drawing on Harry Frankfurt's work, kind of if the second level then is kind of being who you want to be, right? So then this takes it out of the task domain and broadens it to questions of longer term actions. So habits, pursuit of longer term goals, of being goals, as they're called, which then lead into questions of your identity, your values, how you're living by the kind of the starlight that you want to live by. It also relates, I think, kind of these sort of comparative identity issues like social status and pettiness that certainly play into the question of social media a lot. So this would be kind of a lengthening over time and a kind of expanding out to higher levels of the goal hierarchy. And then, sorry. And so then, the third kind of level then of this expansion would be this question of wanting what you want to want. So in Harry Frankfurt's term, it would be like kind of second order volitions. So not just pursuing a task in the moment, like I'm going over to this stove to make my pasta, or task pursuit, goal pursuit over a longer period of time. I want to study to become an engineer, but the ability to figure out that you want those things in the first place, that you want the pasta, or that you want to be an engineer. So these would be things like reflection, vita contemplativa, having that downtime where the mind can wonder, the mind can not be sort of consuming or producing, but try to sort of jumbling stuff around in a kind of a generative way. Imagination. I think one of the big costs today, it's a weird irony that today, there's so much kind of quote unquote imaginative content coming at us, whether it's on Netflix or video games or whatever. And there's a lot of creative stuff, but you're always sort of in someone else's imagination. You're kind of in someone else's trip. And as opposed to, when you sit there, like imagine the worlds that you were in when you read a novel as a kid, like that kind of imagination. To me, it's a very different kind of imagination. And so I think, to the extent that then these things are the foundation of our sense of self, and like as Hannah Arendt has pointed out, as kind of the foundation of culture, of society, leisure. I think she pointed out, that like people who founded the U.S. were men of essentially of leisure, who kind of could spend their time sitting around and thinking about, well, what if we did things this way or that way? And so, I think it's really interesting that there's a productivity of leisure that I think is sort of underappreciated a lot of the time. I think actually there was a book called Leisure, the Base of Culture. Maybe I think T.S. Eliot might have written that forward for it, but anyway, but these kinds of moments where I think we insufficiently associate with being human in the kind of era where we're expected to kind of be productive with everything we do. So anyway, this is kind of one way that then I've kind of tried to expand out the question of attention, and I found it to be a useful concept. And I think as we think about this question of attention, there's an interesting kind of paradox to it, I think, because on one hand, I think we want to use it and put all this stuff under it and kind of use it as this like kind of unifying kind of construct. But on the other hand, I think there are all these problems in the world that we want to apply it to. And I think those two goals are almost in tension, with the unification goal and the goal of kind of application in these different task domains and these different problems. And so what I wanted to do was maybe ask two questions, maybe less about the substance of what that conception of attention might be, was in your question, and maybe two questions more about the form of it. And so I was just thinking through this, and this is just a first pass at some of this, so we can just have a discussion about it. So I was thinking, at the end of the day, like if we're looking for some kind of different conception of attention, a higher conception, more inclusive conception, I think it has to be guided by the question of what we want that conception to do for us. So if we think about what actually makes a new conception of attention useful for understanding the attention economy, for changing the attention economy, I think this is an interesting question. I don't have necessarily the answer to it, but as I was thinking through it, I'm sorry, this was going to be like a sort of a build. You have to blast all this out at you at once. But I was thinking they're kind of like these 9 areas I came up with, and there are definitely more, and some of these overlap. But if we think about like what makes a new conception of attention useful, or could make it useful. So I think if we just take them from the top left. So I was thinking one of them could be essentially like representational fidelity. So like how closely does this mechanism of attention actually mirror mechanisms of attention in the real world, whether that's kind of neuroscientific, psychological, kind of interpersonal. How does it actually map to reality? Another way in which it could be useful is the synthetic potential. So the degree to which it actually can unite conceptions of attention, whether that's across disciplinary boundaries, across cultures, scales of time, even because historically there have been many the different kinds of ways of understanding attention or even attention span. And then I think also that this would sort of relate to like the amount of consensus that's behind a particular conception of attention. And there's another question there that's interesting about how much consensus is actually sort of needed, warranted, justified from kind of moving forward practically with the conception of attention. The other one, so the next one that I call the is-ought interface. So I guess this would just be the extent to which a conception of attention can kind of mediate that descriptive and normative boundary. So like we can use it to understand things that are happening in the world, ways people are giving attention, but then, with little, change, kind of carry that forward then to kind of application contexts, whether that's policy or design or, practical ethics. So the degree to which it can kind of just ease the transition across that boundary. Field readiness, I call this one. So I mean, I guess this is kind of related to the previous one. This would be kind of like, the degree to which a conception of attention can frame the issue in terms that are usable in a given domain. So like the member of the European Parliament, is this conception of attention, something that we can just slot right in and kind of, is it ammunition ready-made for the guns that they're firing in terms of policy? Can it be picked up and used by practitioners, or does it require a kind of additional kind of reformulation and translation? Catalytic power is one. So like the degree to which the conception of attention stimulates analysis or catalyzes action. So there are some kinds of metaphors I think that we use in these domains that, and like I think that the trafficking one is a very potent one in this regard. It can kind of it grabs attention. It's kind of bringing attention to the question of attention. Will it inspire people to act? Will it does it link up with existing, rhetorics or discourses of, whether that's liberation or rights or whatever? So how much does it inspire us to really kind of move forward? That'd be that one. So another dimension of a conception of attention would be its revelatory capacity. So how much does it not only help us understand like current problems, but actually reveal new problems that we didn't know were there? And I'm always fascinated when there's new words that come up for things on in digital contexts, like clickbait. Like I don't know what I called clickbait before the word clickbait. Maybe just like scammy headline or something. But I think that new words, new concepts can help us see new problems. And I think this kind of this recent kind of turn back toward giving attention to attention, I think, is in some way an embodiment of that. So generalizability and adaptability. So how flexible is the concept or model of attention? Can it be applicable to future challenges that don't exist yet? If in 50 years, 100 years, there's some completely different quantum biocomputing, substrate that is kind of just indistinguishable from magic. Will it in some way, in principle, be applicable to that, or is it too tied to our current kind of technological configuration? Rhetorical portability. I mean, this kind of relates to, I guess, the catalytic power one, but ease with which a conception of attention can get traction in the public discourse, and bring attention to those questions of attention. So, is it something that people pick up and use in their own lives? And does it, one literary critic put in a long time ago, does it add to our stock of available reality in a meaningful way? And then the last one would be competitive strength. So this is, I guess, the idea that, like, coming up with the conception of attention, advancing it in the world, part of its success is about how well-formed or fit for purpose that conception of attention is. But part of what its success is actually dependent on the nature of what it's competing against. And like, I think in these kinds of technological contexts, that tends to be the concept of information, or the informational way of framing these issues. So how well can it advance the attentional frame versus other competing frames? So these are just kind of 9 dimensions that, irrespective of kind of the substance of the conception of attention, I think could be, I mean, you could imagine a kind of like scorecard. And it's not to say that a particular conception of attention ought to max out all of these. I think of it almost more like a character creator screen in a video game where you get a certain number of things and you kind of distribute them. But so some contexts, it might be more important to have a conception of attention that has high catalytic power and field readiness for trying to persuade a politician to do something, but in other contexts, it might be, it might be better to, have it be generalizable and, and being able to reveal new dimensions of the problem if you're kind of thinking in a little more long-term kind of technology non-specific way. So these are just kind of the form and not the substance of it. And so the kind of on that last point of competitive strength, this is something I've been thinking about lately, and I don't have it completely clear in my head yet. But I think so. One of the things that I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on, and is why we're actually in the situation again, right? So why is it that we sort of are having to defend the attentional frame, kind of like being on the back foot in a way, like because the world, it presents itself to us attention. Like we shouldn't have to defend that. Like long before we ever conceive of it as this abstraction of information, like it's attention before we ever get to information. And yet it seems so much easier to think of all of these issues in informational terms, like you're saying, to reify it, to make it think of it as a thing, to imagine, packets of information as the thing that we're fundamentally kind of moving around in all this, as opposed to like our own lives, right? Which is what we're actually experiencing. And so why are we in that situation? And I think that there's a sort of push and pull here between these issues of attention and information. And I think, you could trace it back to Herbert Simon and kind of his dichotomy here, where he talks about, how wealth of attention or wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And so, you could think of this as kind of the nature of this whole inversion where, we have this information abundance and then it's kind of, causing us to, now that it's not scarce, but a lot of our systems, a lot of our concepts sort of assume information scarcity. We're having to kind of turn stuff around and think of things in terms of attention scarcity and not information scarcity. So this is kind of one way to think about why we're in this situation, but I don't think it really captures the entire story. Because it just seems to me that like, attention, like there's such a long tradition of this idea of like attention being in a very real sense, like what we are, what life is. And it seems like a dramatic win for sort of this informationalism that it can be seen as the default position today. Such that where people can talk seriously about things like what, I don't know, uploading themselves into computers and this kind of thing. But I think that to the extent that there is a victory kind of here for this informationalist view, I think it kind of comes out of what happened in this sort of the moment or that period where it's like cybernetics as a discipline was being created. 1 minute and scarcity of time as well. With cybernetics was kind of being developed by kind of like Wiener and Shannon and those folks kind of in the late 40s. And I think like looking at kind of those discussions, I think you see a similar kind of conversation as you see here as we're talking about attention. It's kind of the questions of what makes a conception of attention useful for us, and for them it was what makes a conception of cybernetic systems, circular causality, these kinds of this way of looking at things. What makes that useful? And I think it's the success of that cybernetic model, which I think much like the attention landscape, Gordon Pask said, is the art and science of manipulating defensible metaphors. I think there's almost a way in which that's kind of that cybernetics moment and the development of our current conception of information can be a model for what we're trying to do here. And so it seems to me that if we can kind of push that forward and kind of almost use information as the kind of model for the kind of thing that we want to get attention to be, where nobody today says there has to be one conception of information. It doesn't have to be extremely well elaborated, but it still has this kind of dominance in our society and our life. If we can kind of almost get attention up to kind of where information is as a kind of term in terms of kind of the general acceptability of it, I think then we can, then avoid what I see happen time and again in conversations about attention and attention economy, digital technology, where someone will be talking in terms of attention, effects on attention, but then there'll be a point at which usually this kind of escape hatch is pulled, like informationalism, and then there's a reversion back to that informational frame. So I think if we can kind of bring attention, develop the concept of attention kind of in the same way that the concept of information was in that period when cybernetics was being developed, and then in the years since, then I think we can kind of bring attention its due. And I think an enormous part of that is, conversations exactly like this one, where we kind of smash the particles of it all against each other and sort of see what energies and kind of quirks kind of spin out of it, which hopefully I've been able to do a little bit in this presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks. Okay, so now including the online audience, are there any clarificatory questions for James?
Could you say a little bit more about how this movement of cybernetics got so much traction, or and how we could use that in our favor?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing, I think some of it was actually just war and World War II. And one thing I've been really struck by lately is like how much of our lives are come from, what came out of World War II and right after it. The internet itself, computing, like all of these kind of, the United Nations, like various kind of, legal and rights frameworks. Like there is, so I think that there was a great deal of kind of focused attention on these questions at this time. And like even our concept of information came from, like Claude Shannon, Norbert Wiener, they were working on, systems for like, aircraft monitoring, like cryptographic systems. It was like, there was a kind of immediate urgency to figuring out those questions. And so maybe I guess the general answer is there was a kind of urgency motivating it, and there was, I think, and maybe that's a question, I guess, for us. Then it's like, how can we bring a sense of urgency to these questions? Maybe part of the answer to that is the way we use terms in a more kind of motivating way, and a kind of find the right way to talk about things. But I mean, we're not going to get sort of the urgency that a war brings. I mean, but I think that there is. I feel that these questions are very urgent, but it is hard to sort of bring that same level of urgency to the kind of organization of the question. Although I've been hardened, in the last, like, since I started studying this stuff in, I guess, like 2011. I mean, certainly it's much more on the kind of societal agenda. But yeah, so I think that part of it is urgency, part of it is just I mean, obviously they're very well resourced too, when you have millions and millions of dollars being thrown at it by major world governments. So I think that those are a few things, but I'm not an expert in the history of cybernetics. Yeah.
But can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Because you said you think it could be a useful model in the battle to elevate the status of the urgency of the attention problem. But how do you think we could use it then as a model for how can we bridge it or use it in the sphere of attention? Yeah,
sure. So there are certain things that that we could definitely take from it. I think one is the interdisciplinarity of it. And I mean, and there's sort of there were the Macy conferences on cybernetics, and they, people like Margaret Mead, Vannevar Bush, people like that, like had all these people from these different disciplines, kind of coming together and trying to come up with sort of that higher order, or the more general principle that united the ways in which they're thinking, kind of that idea of like systems thinking. That. So I think it's the interdisciplinarity is one thing. I mean, obviously, additional funding can't hurt. Anyone out there is a hello as a funder. But I think, yeah, I do. But I do think that, like, yeah, finding some way to start communicate the urgency of the issue is important. But yeah, I guess when I say the model of it, I guess partly kind of just the nature of the different disciplines including partly the spirit of the conversation, partly the desire to come up with a sort of like a higher principle behind it, like we're doing here. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to set up for our next speaker. Thank you very much, James. Okay, so joining us online is Jeanne Lim, co-founder and CEO of Being AI. She's former CEO of Hanson Robotics. You may know them because they created Sophia, the robot, first one who has a sort of national citizenship. And she was very involved in that project. So thank you very much for being with us today, Jeanne.
Thank you so much, and a pleasure to be here, and good evening from Hong Kong. So my topic, let me share my screen first. Just one second, share it with sound. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, cool. So the topic of my presentation is from attention to engagement. So I'd like to put forward the proposition that in the advent of the age of artificial intelligence, there's a big urgency for us to deliberately and thoughtfully move from passive attention to active engagement with AI. And I completely agree with James that this is probably one of the most important things that we need to address if we say that time is our most precious currency, and also oil, data is our new oil. I don't know whether any of you has been to Asia and been at one of these big buffets. So I also need to sort of ask for you to excuse the lighthearted approach to this very serious problem. So the reason is because I work in the commercial world, and so this is my modus operandi to be able to make these messages relatable to the mass audience. But this is a very sophisticated group, so apologies for that. So to me, this is basically the infinite spread of life. You know, we have in Asia, we have this spread that covers all cultures, you know, all different food. And, you know, people love it, not just the tourists, but also the local people who go with their families on the weekend. But of course, we have a limited appetite and, you know, one stomach. So we take a slice of life. And this is exactly what the machines do. So basically, the machines kind of look at what you've picked in life, and then it serves a lot of it, more of it, to you. This is the content filtering recommendation algorithm. Or it actually looks at who you look like and then serve similar things to you. And so this is probably the crown jewel of the Netflix and the Amazon platforms. And for search algorithm, what they're doing is basically, you know, we're trying to get the attention of the crawler so that when the crawler crawls the meta tags and the content and also the good user experience, it would serve up, when you actually search for that keyword, it will serve up the right information to you. But it's not actually the information, it's actually the link to the real information. For social media, this is probably the topic that everybody is talking about right now. And so for social media, we have, you know, a lot of people involved in liking things, clicking things, creating contents. So basically what happens is then you get served up the things that they think that you like, and you pay attention to it. And of course, now we're getting into the bots, right? I think people are saying that there's like 15, 20, 25% of the social media is actually occupied by bots right now. So for large language model, those with the transparency of training data, just like the GPT-3, they've actually released how they trained on. They're trained on a corpus of human-created information, like maybe over 50 billion pages of websites, and also books, and also dialogue pairs of conversations. So we kind of know what they're trained on. But then now with a lot of these new language models like GPT-4, GPT 4.5, even I think Google, there's a little bit of opaqueness in the way they train the data. So we really don't know where the information comes from. So there's a problem with black box algorithms right now. And so when we generate contents from there, whether it's images or audio or text, there's a black box effect. We don't exactly know how they come up with the decision and the contents that they serve up to us. So that's why, you know, you've been hearing a lot of conversations around biases that are hidden in the large language models. And in the virtual reality space and metaverse, it gets even more interesting, because once you're inside a space, everything gets tracked. It tracks, you know, where you're looking, your emotions, basically everything is up for grabs. So what I'd like to say is basically we have a limited attention span, and the machine is actually curating our attention in a way that I don't know whether it actually makes sense for us, but it is kind of heavily curating our attention. And so from curated attention, we have an opportunity to go to a curated life where we get more of what we wanted or thought we wanted. And presumably, this gives us perennial gratification. But I'm not sure, you know, that scene is exactly what we want, right? So how do we achieve contentment, yet still have access to all the possibilities? So we get our shrimp, and then we still have access to these different experiences. So looking at this from a Buddhist lens, I think Buddhism can provide a certain framework for us to be more discerning and to create our own lives. So we look at moral clarity, wisdom, and attention mastery as the tools. So for the moral clarity, looking at the 5 moral precepts of Buddhism, to not kill somebody and not grab what is not yours, and so forth. So, you know, to be basically non-harming. And also to understand that the true nature of all things are impermanent and interconnected. So there's like a whole lot of the world that we could experience, and, you know, experience our interconnectedness and not just fulfill our desires. And attention mastery. So we need to manage our attention, manage our minds, so that we could decide what to focus on, so that we could attend to things that bring true and lasting meaning to our lives. But algorithms, of course, are increasingly curating our experiences and what we spend time on. So it's a difficult thing to do. So if you think about it, then AI also needs to mirror our values in curating our attention. So AI also needs to have moral clarity, wisdom, and attention that mirrors ours. But how do we do it? So this is from a few years ago. This is called the data dress. So it's created by Google in collaboration with a fashion brand, and it captures what we like, what we do every hour, every minute, every second. So, you know, so it's basically learning the what. But AI should actually not just learn our what, but our why. So it can infuse our experiences with our intention, our values, and our meaning. So we need to move from passive attention to active engagement with AI, with deliberation and thoughtfulness. So we could co-create a life of unlimited potential in symbiosis with AI. So this is what our company does. We create AI beings and the underlying technology platform that allows people to have a empathic interface with AI to build engagement, trust, and a co-creative relationship. So I've been the one doing all the talking, so I'm letting our AI being talk a little bit.
In the glitz and glamour of the attention economy, humans and AI can tango in harmony by complementing each other's strengths. Humans bring creativity and emotional intelligence, while AI offers data crunching and pattern recognition. Together, we could create a world where information is tailored to enrich lives, not just hog attention.
Right, that's my presentation. It's my contact, if you'd like to get in touch.
Thank you. Short clarificatory questions for Jeanne, and then we'll move on to a more inclusive discussion.
Maybe simple question.
Yeah.
Clarification. I wonder what is the kind of business model that underlies this sort of research and development?
Yeah, this is such an excellent question. I think this is the key questions that a lot of AI companies are grappling with, the business model, right? So what we're working on is a platform that allows people to curate the contents and the knowledge so that they could deploy it to their audiences. That allows us to, not be involved in creating all the experiences, but to actually provide that platform to anybody who has information, knowledge, or contents to disseminate. And then we're going to be charging a subscription model. We're on a subscription model for all kinds of content creators and, educators and people who are in professional learning and also leadership development to use.
Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else? No? Okay, so now I think that we are open to questions for either of our speakers.